I start recording. So let's not punish the punctual. It's 5:30 Pacific sharp, and we are officially starting. Welcome to Agile Practitioner Online User Group. This is session number 28. We are over 2 years old. This session will be recorded. Actually, it is already recorded. So please be aware. And this is where you could find a recording of all our previous sessions. I'm going to put it into a chat, a link where you could find a recording of this session as well as all previous sessions. My name is Alexander Frumkin, but people at the industry know me by my nickname, Sasha. Guys, please put yourself on mute. I don't want to use a brutal force.
Writing down.
Okay. That's okay.
Louis.
Just a second. It looks like I would have to do it.
Luisa.
So please, guys, please put yourself on mute if you are not talking. So my name is Alexander Frumkin, and I'm an Agile coach in San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm a facilitator of this group.
Disgusting form to find you.
Yes, please put yourself on mute. Okay. So this is a group. We started this group about 2.5 years ago. As usually, we get together every second Wednesday of the month for an hour and a half. But today, because of the importance of this session, we extended in 2 hours. This session, I prepared it together with my friends from CTC user group, Emilia Breton and Saf Ahmed. Special thank you to Saf actually for this idea of setting up this session. This user group is affiliated with Scrum Alliance, so you could claim your 1 point for attending this session. I call this as a battle of agile frameworks because we know a clickbait headline gets more hits. In reality, in a battle, one side wins and another loses. In our panel discussion, everybody wins because we are all going to learn. By the way, we are expecting the audience to have at least some basic knowledge of all 3 frameworks. We don't expect it to be like a crash course for newbies. We are not trying to say that one framework is better or another is worse. Each framework has their own strengths and weaknesses. And today we have great panelists, 3 great panelists that will help us to explore these strengths and weaknesses together. So how we are going to facilitate it? So first, I would like my partner in crime, Emilia and Saf, to introduce themselves and share their expectations of this session. And then we'll pass the ball to panelists to introduce themselves. Then we'll start our panel discussion with a few questions that our organizational team put together. And we had some help from our colleagues from CTC user group. This question will be addressed to all 3 panelists, and we'll give them 2 minutes time boxes to answer. For simplicity, I suggest answering this in the following order: Les, Gene, Safe, Scott, and Scrum of Scrums, Rob. And I'll be facilitating this part. Emilia will keep an eye on the clock. If you have questions, because we have so many participants, please don't ask them now. Just type your questions in the chat box so that Saf will keep an eye on these questions. Once we finish with like official part of the panel, we'll open it up for Q&A questions. Again, please don't just ask them, please type them into a chat box, and Emilia and Saf would facilitate. And please, when you type your question, please start it with whom you would like to address it. For example, I have a question to Scott, blah, blah, blah. I have a question to all panelists. And we'll probably spend about 30 minutes in our Q&A question. And at about 7:30 Pacific, we are going to wrap it up. Any questions for me so far, guys? Okay. In this case, I'm happy to pass the ball to Emilia. Please, what's your expectation? Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Amelia Breton. I am one of the CTCs who's part of the CTC user group where this idea came out. Safe's wonderful idea. And so I'm just here today to help facilitate and create a great container for y'all. Good luck. Safe, on for you.
Thank you, Emilia. My name is Saf Ahmed. I'm an Agile coach, primarily a consultant for financial industry, most of the big banks I work here in East Coast. Thank you, special thank you to all the three panelists, and definitely thank you to all the participants from across different places, different time zones. Let's just get started and make it a fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Saf. Thank you, Emilia. It's great to be working together to put this all together. And with this, I'll pass the ball to Gene. Please introduce yourself so that people know who you are. You're on mute, Gene. Okay.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Thanks to Sasha and everyone who made an effort to put this together. I'm Gene. I'm based out of New York City. I live and work here. My main focus is on organizational design, system dynamics, coaching, consulting, training, mentoring, and advisory. Have been doing this for quite a few years. Know some of you folks on the call, and thank you for coming and supporting. I'm going to leave it at that. And of course, I strongly support the community, locally and globally, including CTC and CEC Community of Scrum Alliance. Obviously, you guys made a great effort to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for accepting our invitation. Scott, the ball goes to you.
All right. So my name is Scott Frost. I have been working in this space for a long time. The first 20 years of my career was all in coming up as a developer and going through the typical corporate IT shops and up the ranks. The past dozen or so years, I've been either an Agile coach or a transformation coach of some sort in various organizations. I'm currently working as a transformation coach for Accenture and work with a my focus is SAFE, and I'm a SAFE SPCT as well as a SAFE fellow. But I really appreciate and want to thank you for the opportunity, because I think it's really great to get different perspectives together. So much of what we do is all tied back and linked to the same roots. So it's really great to mix and match the conversations. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Scott, for jumping right on. Robert.
How you doing, y'all? This is Rob Froman. Yeah, thank you very much for putting this together. It is really cool to see the walls coming down across frameworks. I think that, at least with, I run a small management consultancy. We focus across the value stream, and we work largely at scale. So as you can imagine, running a single framework or even recommending that a single framework will solve all of your problems is something that just doesn't exist in my world. And it's really wonderful to see these topics coming out. So I want to thank the panel for and all the attendees. Please challenge us with those questions. I'm hoping to learn a lot as we walk through this together. And I'll be representing the Scrum at Scale aspect of this. I'm a Scrum at Scale trainer and a licensed Scrum trainer. So looking forward to your questions, and looking forward to digging in.
Thank you, dear panelists, for introduction. Now let this most peaceful battle in the world begin. So this is the first question, and I would like you to answer this question in the same order. And you have 1 minute for answer. Emilia will keep an eye on the clock. If you had to tweet the essence of your framework, what would it be like?
Me.
Yeah.
So large-scale Scrum is Scrum. So if you understand Scrum, I don't have to explain to what less is. However, we use it in large-scale Scrum development where products are bigger rather than smaller, and they require more than just one team. Usually we look at 2 to 8 teams working on the same product for the same product owner. We hate fractalism. Out of the same product backlog towards the same shared PSPI, potential shippable product increment. We use cross-functional feature team as an organizational building block while removing all overburden, waste, and redundancy that sits in between. Another keyword would be used the scaling, waste reduction, and body of knowledge collected over more than a decade without any intention to become a commercial product.
Thank you, Gene. The same question to Scott. Would you like me to repeat the question?
No, I'm good. So, I would say that, SAFe is prescriptive enough, in quotes, right? That even the largest organizations can begin reorganizing around value. Focus on agile teams, grow your teams, grow your competencies as an enterprise, right? Customer centricity, product innovation, lean agile thinking and flow, and focus on those bigger things that scaling is there to help you solve.
Thank you, Scott. Rob, you have the floor.
I think Scrum at Scale in a heartbeat is really it's a lightweight framework, lowest minimum viable bureaucracy, if you will, that permits you to scale your organization with scale-free architectures. So the intent is that we don't hit upper limits in terms of organizational design if we architect them in the right way. And some of that primary focus is in primarily 3 areas: prioritization, delivering value, and making sure that we have an opportunity to restructure the organization in such a way that helps deliver that product. So I think this is going to be an interesting overlap with the LESS framework.
Okay, thank you, panelists. The next question would be, what differentiates your framework from other frameworks? Gene.
First, I will say that LESS, as I mentioned, was never invented to become a commercial product. It has more than a decade of research, investigation, experiments, and experiences. It has 3 books written, 600 documented experiments. So it's a pretty monumental effort that was made to put this together as a body of knowledge. It was not created reactively to meet industry needs, to scale, to make it a successful, easy to sell product. It is very deep and narrow. When we talk about LESS adoptions, it is deep and narrow as opposed to broad and shallow. It's not a new or improved Scrum buried underneath of many organization orthodox layers of organizational complexity, with rebranding of old names into new naming convention. And LESS does strongly recommend not having fractalism in the organizational structure. So it's one product owner per up to 8 teams working on the same product backlog. So it's Scrum in essence with some very minimalistic add-ons. So we use a Scrum team. We call it a team. We don't call it Scrum team as a organizational building block. Time.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Okay.
Have the floor, please.
So here's my little art here. So SAFe also embraces Scrum. You know, what I would say is, you know, SAFe as a system, right? Or as John Cotter's talks in his book Accelerate, you know, a dual operating system, right? It's really there not only to distill and kind of share this whole body of knowledge to the marketplace and to those who are both inside development in traditional sense, but also in products and solution evolution that extends far beyond what we all know in Scrum in general. You know, so one of our sort of biggest things that you see is this continuous revisions and extending that body of knowledge and putting it out there to be, you know, shared based on all the learnings and things that we're getting. So we're really looking to kind of take that frequency of pace that everyone is asking for, continue to extend, evolve it, have this sort of, you know, model redesign that's built into that sort of transformation of focusing on value. What problem are you trying to solve? What process improvements are you trying to make? What management system needs to be in place to support and enable that? What people capabilities and upskilling are needed? And then obviously the whole framework behind, you know, behaviors and principles and values, right? So it's all kind of woven in together. It feels complex to some, but for many of the implementations that we've had, it's been fairly straightforward to launch and sustain. So I think I'll leave it there.
Right.
Scott.
So for me, what makes Scrum at Scale really interesting to me is it's a lightweight framework. So it will take a little bit of maturity to implement. But that lightweight framework allows an organization to really sense and respond to changing conditions. And the way I look at it, when we look at the fourth technology revolution, and if you haven't had a chance to read that or scan that article from the, I'm happy to send it, but really around the fact that we're really pivoting into a new era here. When we look at things like where was Lyft and Uber, you know, 5 years ago, and the fact is they didn't exist. So things are accelerating. So when I look at large businesses, their need to sense and respond to changing conditions, changing technology, distributed teams, is really making it necessary for them to pivot quickly. So we need frameworks that allow us to do that. And but you need, at the same time, you need this idea of a minimum viable bureaucracy. So just enough structure in place that enables consistency and alignment across the organization. So I think this is where Scrum at Scale's sweet spot is it kind of dovetails right in there. And it provides an organization the ability to communicate up and down across. It allows them to scale fairly linearly, which is kind of cool. And there's a big focus on organizational impediment removal. This is something that personally I've had a lot of experience with. And it's really great to be able to see organizational impediments not only surfaced, but then addressed and removed. So that's one of the things I think is one of the powerful aspects of Scrum at Scale.
Thank you, guys. Here comes another question. What has been your favorite implementation of your framework?
I'm up.
Yep.
So I guess I had a few attempts in my career. They were all deep and narrow as opposed to broad and shallow. The one that really committed to memory was a large fintech. It took about a year, close to a year to get it all up and running. There's actually a case study written on this. It's still in draft, but I can share offline. We had a long period of education of senior management and individuals that were involved. We actually, the effort was shared by me and my former colleague who was a very senior hands-on software engineer. So it was a dual flight. what we had to cover was a lot of lands of organizational design, system dynamics, team dynamics, technical and engineering practices. And large-scale Scrum is very strong on engineering excellence. It was involved team self-formation, going from component teams, component-centric teams, to feature-centric teams, feature development teams, custom-centric teams. This effort involved reducing the number of various roles. We addressed lots of HR issues, expanded the product, realigned teams from subsystems to one product, identified product owners, subject matter experts, did various things. Also had an IRS built, impediment removal service, a short network between doers and senior leadership for escalation, which was pretty effective way to expose organizational dysfunctions. It was a non-hierarchy-based escalation mechanism flow. As I mentioned, improving engineering practices, created some communities for functional learning. We don't call them communities of practice, but it's essentially the same thing. Also touched upon things such as agile budgeting and obviously overall organizational design flattening. That was an important thing.
Awesome.
So, time.
Thank you, Gene.
So this is Scott. My favorite in the safe space is, of course, anytime a leader doesn't say 3 months in, are we done yet? Those are your good ones. Because we all know it takes a long time. I tend to focus on Fortune 50 and larger. And in that mix is a really large company, global company with lots of divisions. And the business unit in the largest division really is the one who drove it rather than it being IT driven. Now, everything they were doing was digital transformation, and working across, functional across the various divisions. But, as we started launching and started getting teams of Agile teams up and running, which we call ARTs, Agile Release Trains, we very quickly demonstrated to the leadership that the teams are going to be capable of outproducing things they've ever done in at least the recent past, right? They're used to releases every couple of years, right? And within the first 12 weeks, they already had new, good, big value out there. And it came at the operations side of the business so quickly, they were unprepared for that success, right? It caught them off guard, and it really got the leaders thinking about what's capable. And over time, that rippled across the entire enterprise. So every part of that organization is now using the constructs, right, from the portfolio all the way down to the teams. They have dozens of release trains, lots of solution trains, pulling lots of big things together in lots of portfolios. And within that, we all love the cadence and rhythm and synchronization of things like Scrum. In SAFE, we use Kanban system to help govern portfolio flow. And in this particular case, we had a large group of senior executives who were always shoving new things in the system, right? It's like, the shiny thing of the day, you say you start everything, but you finish little. And when they, several months in and had a really good lean portfolio and good agile budgeting in place, they began to see that when they shoved too hard, the system choked. And so they realized that as leaders, they were creating some of the angst down below. And so they pulled back and they began to pay attention to flow and a lot of those lean metrics. And that gave the system a much quicker pace and acceleration that although the teams are continuing to evolve, as good agile teams should, the leaders were also doing that and understanding their impacts on the system, when
Awesome.
you look at things in the end.
Time. Thank you, Scott.
All right, this is Rob. One of the things I like about the Scrum Scale is if you go back to if any of you have read the version 1 State of Agile report, and I think it was just most recently this year, they identified one of the most important things to identify within an agile transformation to make sure that it's successful is to have executive sponsorship. And I rally against that. No pun intended there. What we focus on is executive engagement. I don't need a CIO to have a golf game with another CIO and kick off an agile transformation because it's the coolest thing to do. I want to demand that executives are actually engaged. So the engagements that we work in, and we work with medium-sized companies to Fortune 50 as well. And it's really getting that leadership to buy into the idea that they own this thing. And the executive action team permits us to actually do that and drive it. And the change in the organization is pretty powerful. It allows us to really escalate challenges and get decision makers to come to the table and make calls. So that's a lot of fun when I get a chance to actually do that. And we haven't had a situation yet where I've been blown off by what would be an eat, though it does take time to. So any of you that have tried this, to get executives to really buy in and understand that their job is to actually drive this thing, not just to write a check, can be really it can make the transformations themselves much more fun. And having the framework available to give us the construct that says that, listen, your job is to make decisions, write checks, and start driving change is a pretty powerful, and it does change the organization more rapidly in my mind. I'm being efficient. I'm being lean in my time.
Sasha, you are on mute.
Okay. Thank you. So the next question is, how would you say frameworks mixed between each other?
I'm up.
Can you repeat that?
How do you mix framework? That's the question.
Got it. Thanks, Gene.
I got some private pings recommending keep my hands away from my mouth. I apologize if I was muffled. I'll try to be more, I will try to project better. To the question itself, I don't understand what's the point. Something that has I'm going to speak of less, something that has a historical track record of a decade plus of many experiments, failures and successes, tries and avoids, obviously has gone through a huge gamut, a wide array of add-ons and removals. So to me, it's a bit of a oddness to add something that is not called for. So if we analyze less and we identify any emissions and you say, well, why isn't it there? Let's add it. Maybe we can have a discussion. But just to mix for the sake of mixing, I'm not sure if that makes sense. Less adoptions are by scaling up as opposed to tailoring down. If you're familiar with the concept of sunk cost fallacy, when you have something that you invested a lot of money in, something big, monolithic, monumental, all-inclusive, and you paid a gazillion of dollars for it, what are the odds you're going to scale it down and not use some of it? If you bought it, you're going to use it. And we are very well aware of this, so we try to we try to start with minimalistic needs and build up only if needed. So we don't add for the sake of adding. That's what the essence of less. I'm sure there are other frameworks that prefer to start with unpacking the entire gamut of things and perhaps not using what they think is not needed. But my odds are going in favor of you are going to be using it if you paid for it. So I don't see any purpose of mixing unless there's a very strong reason something is missing and you have identified it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so this is Scott, and I would say, I agree a lot with what Gene is saying, but I'll look at it from a different perspective. I remember I was at the big retail show in 2010, I think it was, when the whole bimodal IT was kind of presented and talked about. And it's really hard to operate in multiple mental models, right? We're not very good at it as humans. So I think you do have to make some choices around that. Can you have different parts of really, really large enterprises that need more or less? No pun intended. Yeah, certainly you can. You can have different instances, if you will, of the need to have agility and to scale it. And I think that's okay. And I think in SAFE, what we tried to do is create these sort of configurations, if you will, that begin with that essentials, right? What's the, in the early days, we kind of called it minimum viable safe, right? But what's those essential elements that you need to begin, which is really agile teams and teams of agile teams. And as you scale up, you can add different capabilities, whether it be large solution or portfolio. In the case of government, you may not have portfolio. And so there's some different nuances related to that. But I do think when you start trying to mix too many things, you will get people that will be confused by the terms. You know, they're similar, but not the same, right? The practices are, you know, everybody understands Scrum and can follow that. But what if you need Kanban system? What if you're more of a help desk or research team, you know, that things don't fit as easily, you know, into that level of cadence and flow? They might want to do something in a different way. So there has to be some level of capability around multiple models or practices. But I do agree, it's really hard to kind of mix and match. We've seen people try to do that, or try to customize things in a little bit too much. You know, I think, you know, kind of as Gene said, that at some point you need what you need and you should use it. And you shouldn't try to overthink or layer on too many different approaches.
All right, thank you, Scott. That's time.
Well, this is Rob. I may differ from my panel members here a little bit, but also agree in some areas. I have a lot of experience now actually blending a lot of frameworks. And really what it comes down to for me, especially in very large organizations, the cultural needs going to dominate the practices that we have to put in place, right? So the practices are going to be what we put in place to help reinforce behavior until the culture takes root. And culture changes last. So, you know, for me personally, I think the idea that one size fits all is hard for me to swallow, because I don't think that Morgan Stanley and Chase Manhattan Bank are the same company. They will operate differently, and their business rules actually dictate that. What I found, though, I do agree with the panelists here that there are, especially when it comes down to the teams, I don't care if teams on the ground are doing waterfall. As long as it's empirical and disciplined, I'm good with it, because when I do start to scale that up through the value stream, through the program, and into the portfolio, I need to measure it. I need to be able to assess it and make sure that it's operating effectively. But at the end of the day, I'm just not religious on somebody that has to, you know, everybody has to do Scrum or everybody has to do Kanban on the ground. But at the mid-level, one of the things I like about Scrum at Scale is it doesn't actually dictate what you have to do. And I've had a lot of success. One of the things that SAFE has done a great job for our community is the establishment of the concept of the PI. And I work with clients that literally fly everybody every quarter to a central location. And that is friggin' awesome to get that face-to-face. It allows these teams to come together, get to know each other, so that when they go back to their corners of the world, they actually still function as a team. And the last thing I would ever want to do is tell an organization, stop doing that, because it's really effective. But I think we can augment SAFE with some of the other principles around scale, let's say in Scrum at Scale, around the idea of scaling the Scale Daily Scrum, for example. It really helps get right to the top of the organization, not to the VP, but I mean right to the top of the organization at that executive action team, and allow that person to have visibility into the organization. So I am a proponent of blending frameworks, but you know, we don't want to do it for the purpose of blending frameworks. There needs to be rationale and justification behind why we do that. So understanding the frameworks broadly is important, so that you can bring the right practices to bear in your organization.
Thank you, Robert. That's time. You're still on mute again, Sasha.
Yeah, it really helps to unmute myself.
Too efficient.
So what would you name as the main challenge for your network, for your framework? Gene, you're on mute.
Yeah. So the main challenge. So I guess, and I'm going to frame this. Well, to me personally, since I stand by less at this point in my career, and probably for a while so far, lack of public awareness. Less is not, to me at least, it's a challenge. It is not as well known simply because it had never been marketed as a framework. It had never been marketed as a commercial, unpack and install way to solve all problems of mankind. It has the longest history. It has the longest research and body of knowledge. As I mentioned, look for any other approach or framework that has been documented thoroughly through more than a decade by writing books, and you will not find it. So to me, the biggest challenge is lack of awareness. And unfortunately, people and organizations fall for best marketed and easiest to unpack and install best practices and some canned solutions. And unfortunately, maybe even less is being perceived as, oh, just another framework, another commercial way to make money. Less isn't that. I genuinely hope that 2020, and I'm actually keeping my fingers on the pulse of the industry. Hopefully, the year 2020 will be the year of more blunt discussions, of more candid conversations, and some exposure. I do think we have reached a point where we need to talk about things that some organizations are not willing, not comfortable discussing. And so maybe when these conversations become more of a common thing to do, a large-scale Scrum will become more of a common knowledge. To me, that's the biggest challenge at the moment. It's not well known, especially in the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So on the SAFe front, I think a lot of the challenge that I bump into is the sense that the big picture is too big, right? That it's got too much in it and it's too prescriptive. And I don't believe it is, having been, in using SAFe and being a part of that evolution for so many years now, since almost the beginning. I don't feel that at all day to day in the way we use it. And, in the end, it's just a framework, right? It's just a mental model set of sort of how to connect the structure of the organization and however they need to evolve. And some of it is, not only, just choice, some of it is by design, the way their operating entities are set up. And then connecting that to the social structure of how we actually get things done. And so I think there's a lot of variability in there, and a lot of things that we think we can represent in different ways and be very successful at it. And so I think we get a lot of challenge out of explaining that and getting people to see that it can be small if that's what you need it to be, or it can be full and robust. But I do agree, and I think my really sort of excitement about the sort of 2020 and beyond is the new 5.0 and the focus on business agility and really getting out beyond traditional development of solutions and products and extending into agile business teams. I think that's going to be a really positive thing for the industry as a whole, as well as for companies in the value that they're creating.
Thank you, Scott.
All right, this is Rob. I actually want to call out one of the comments by Juan here, who's making a comment around seeing that most these scaling frameworks focus primarily on engineering, but not on the product cycle. And I have to agree that there's been a bias in our industry around this. And Scrum at Scale falls prey to this a little bit. It is more heavy on what is called the Scrum Master cycle than the product cycle. And one of the things that I would call out as a weakness of the framework is if you're familiar with the product owner cycle, you'll see that there's a link between our strategic vision and then your product backlog. And in my experience as an Agilist, that's where the damn miracle occurs. And it is really hard to go from strategy to backlog. And there are other frameworks that come into play, even including things like design thinking, service design, and other aspects that may come in, and it's really not spoken to too much. The Scrum Scale group is aware that this is a challenge, and they're actually actively working on it. One of the cool things about the framework is that it does allow us to contribute to the framework itself. We have GitHub accounts and so forth that we can contribute to, and it's an area that they're focusing on. But I think that that's one area where I would like to see Scrum at Scale improve, and it's an area that I'm actually quite passionate about helping them move it forward.
Oh, thank you, Robert. The next question is, how does your framework support Agile principles? Gene, that's for you.
Yep, I'm up. I'm going to frame this very simple. So first of all, less is Scrum. So if we question how less supports Agile principles, we're back to square one. How does Scrum support Agile principles? 4 Agile postulates and 12 Agile principles. I'm going to paraphrase actually Ken Schwaber, one of the co-creators of Scrum. That is not going to be Scrum 2.0. It is not it's not something in a version. Neither will be less. Less is Scrum, so it will not be versioned. And I'm going to say something that probably maybe it's not obvious, but again, if people go back and realize how much research and effort has been put in defining less, a decade plus, it's not a short time period. 3 books, one of the first book that was written, it has immense amount of information on workflow management, Toyota production system, Kanban, queuing theory, lean thinking, system thinking, economics of product development, you name it. So that body of knowledge is embedded in less. One thing I'm going to say also about supporting versus not supporting Agile principles, I don't hear many complaints about less out there that have to do with, well, hey, we adopted less and nothing has changed. I do hear many conversations about other approaches where people say, hey, where are all those Agile principles? Do we really support them? We have adapted this other framework, this other approach, but nothing really has changed. A half year has gone by. More complaints about less that I've heard, quote unquote. They are more of a, hey, it's so hard to adapt unless we change fundamentally this and that, unless we look into HR practices, unless we look into event management, unless we look into site strategies. So we do challenge things in large scale Scrum. It all boils down to one big statement. Organizational design is the first order factor that defines system dynamics. And whereas other frameworks may not necessarily willing to challenge it, quote unquote, less does it. So deep and narrow is not easy.
Thank you, Gene. That's time.
Yep.
Yeah, so on the safe side, obviously we, follow the same, Agile manifesto roots and the principles that go along with that as everyone else, because that's what we all grew up with. And as it extended and we added Reinertson's principles, product development flow and lean, and I have a master's in TQM, so that's my background, is total quality and lean, and the systems thinking and all that building blocks that extend beyond the Agile team into teams of teams and such. I think that is just built upon the principles that exist and continue to sort of grow and extend them. But I do think you have to look beyond the original principles are immutable. They're going to stay. They're always going to be the same. But you have to also look at it in terms of, business teams, HR teams, and other teams who are reading the manifesto, for example, and saying, well, but we don't build software. Well, everyone's a software company. We all know that in this day and age, in the digital age, but they have to have someone, I think, a lot of times to sort of help them understand the connections, make the connections, back to those, core Agile principles and kind of understand that. And there's always going to be the evolution. DevOps came along a few years ago and that extended. And now we're all talking about business agility, which has some levels of extension and thinking of organizational agility. What does that mean? What's lean portfolio management mean? How do you build upon using the Agile principles and then extending them, into different parts of that operating model that companies need to have? So I think you have to look across all of that over time as you're rolling in and extending into the organizations.
Thank you, Scott.
All right, this is Rob. Of course, as has been pointed out here, you know, all these frameworks were rooted by Agile principles. We all hopefully believe in them. Again, it's not religion. It's if you're not doing what's happening in the Agile Manifesto, then you're not bad. You're just not efficient and probably producing crappy products, right? So, in my mind, the way Scrum at Scale approaches this is it actually takes those Agile principles out of the Agile Manifesto and scales them in a sense. So things have changed. We're 19 years into the Agile Manifesto at this point, so it is no longer necessarily about software. So thanks for pointing that out, Scott. You know, today it's about products and services. Our company works with nonprofits, right? And it's great to talk to them about. I've literally had HR people and nonprofits say to me, you know, Rob, you worked at Cisco, you were producing products. We don't produce products. And it's like, but you deliver value, right? Wouldn't you please cure cancer faster? That would be awesome. Like, please do that, right? And if you use Scrum or you use these lean Agile frameworks, they'll probably help you do that. So I think the way Scrum at Scale looks at it is we look at the Agile Manifesto from a position of scale. So it's no longer about making sure that that engineering team is delivering value. Is the organization delivering value? You know, can we reorganize our organization? Can we put the OD in to make sure that the people and processes and everything else is balancing out in accordance with the delivery of high value products and services? So if you just level up the thinking, that the Agile Manifesto operates still very well today at the engineering team, product team, you know, CX team on the ground. Please continue to apply that. But when we look at the principles and the values at scale, how are we doing there? And so that's how I think the Scrum at Scale framework is actually approaching it.
Thank you, Robert. What type of organization could most benefit from your network, from framework?
They all can.
Am I audible? Test. Test. Am I audible? Yes, I am. Right.
Yes, we can hear you, Gene.
Yes. So what organization would benefit most?
Yes. What type of organization?
So if we're talking about industries, I'm not going to be too specific because in any industry, Scrum could work, just like we said before. And I think I would fully agree with this statement today. It isn't just software. In hardware, in manufacturing, we could use Scrum, and so we can and we could large-scale Scrum. So it's really not about the industry, I would assume. Now, the type of organization, from a standpoint of design and culture, that would be mostly susceptible to less adoption. I guess it's the organization where senior leadership, first and foremost, is willing to deeply learn, where people do not feel that they are exempt from additional education, whereas senior management does not just delegate learning and adoption to cohorts underneath them. We do say in large-scale Scrum, we need an informed consent from senior management that they're willing and ready to go through with less adoptions, because some organizational implications of less adoptions are up the alley to senior management to handle. HR-related matters, budgeting, finance, vendor management, site strategies, performance appraisals, monetary rewards, perks and bonuses. I really hope people understand that less isn't just a framework. It's the monumental body of knowledge and experiments that have been collected over many years. And although it may sound like, hey, it's just another framework, it is. I treat it really as a body of knowledge and a huge, very universal toolbox that you can pick and choose from and apply. Of course, the experiments that I'm referring to, but of course, the large-scale Scrum framework is defined pretty well in terms of principles and guidelines and rules. And of course, one more important thing, and I think someone quoted John Carter: resistance to change and urgency to change. Specifically, if there is no urgency to change for an organization, for whatever reason, adoption of less would be much more difficult because it may easily turn into a box checking exercise because it's the next trendy thing in the marketplace.
Thank you, Gene. That's time. Scott?
We're on time, huh?
Yeah, and I'll start by echoing what Gene said right at the last, which is, you know, those organizations who really aren't interested in change, they're just wanting to check a box and do the flashy whatever's floating around on the airplanes in first class conversations. Those are the organizations that aren't going to benefit really from any of these change models, right? And I would say that certainly because we're talking about scaling agility, the smallest of companies, if you're just 5 people, then Scrum is great. Stick with that, right? Or Scrum and Kanban or some combination thereof, or that'll be great. You know, as you begin to need those larger connective capabilities, and there was a question earlier around in the chat around sort of the 2 operating systems and eventually does organizational design and hierarchy go away? Well, no, not really, because every organization is going to have a structure to it. There's some management structure that has to be in place as you get larger and larger. The question is it the minimum amount? And is it designed in such a way that is flexible when the need for the value chains and the value streams change to deliver that value? Or is it going to impede that, right? So I think you have those things that you have to think about. And, you know, you watch organizations in the small and mid-size range using SAFe very successfully that I've seen, but I think the biggest companies are, it's a little bit easier for them to kind of wrap their arms around because there's a little more structure to it. One of my customers said several years ago, we're better editors than authors. And so if you give us a little bit more prescriptive sense up front, we can distill the things we need and use it the right way. But it's easier for us to do that than to create it ourselves and to sort of organically grow it.
Thank you, Scott. That's time.
This is Rob. Yeah, I'd like to echo my co-panelists here as well. Again, at the small end of the spectrum, that there are, you know, the other frameworks are available. Scrum, Kanban, whatever you might be using is very effective. And I don't think that applying Scrum at scale necessarily in a small startup makes a whole lot of sense. Where I think organizations benefit primarily from Scrum at scale is in large companies. We found that it really comes into, they're kind of falling into 2 camps in my experience so far. One is very large corporations that are looking to get their mojo back. And we're working with some very large companies that are resulted from, you know, mergers and acquisitions. So they have, you know, a confluence of cultures and practices and tooling. So that's a place where organizational impediments are really important to escalate and escalate quickly. The other type of organization is large, medium to large, but growing fast. It's very easy to become disconnected. You get these event horizons that produce themselves organizationally. It's not that the organization wants to build silos. It just is, I don't have a chance to talk to my colleagues for 2 months because we're too damn busy. So this is another area. So I would argue that this is actually another area in that latter case where a combination of both Scrum at scale and OKRs can provide a great way to bring alignment to an organization as they grow rapidly. You need OKRs as an alignment framework, and then you need Scrum at scale as a work decomposition, prioritization, and execution framework. And they can dovetail very, very closely together. So it really is in those 2 arenas. Scale starts, just as a side note, I think in my mind, scale starts smaller than a lot of us think. As a nod to Les, just to put it out there, scale can start with 3 teams. Just to be really clear, scale is not a number of people, it's complexity. So if you have a complex organization, where you're trying to do different things or different structures, you have 2 engineering teams and 1 support team, I'm going to argue you're at scale because you have 2 different groups with different languages that are trying to communicate and deliver consistently. So, you know, again, to a nod to the idea that, you know, less operating from 2 to 9 teams, you are at scale potentially at that level too. So understanding what we mean by scale is important as well.
Thank you. That's time.
Thank you. How does your framework incorporate lessons from the field?
Yeah, I'm up. Well, I think I'm going to be probably repeating myself here, but I think I mentioned this in different places at different times today. Large-scale Scrum was never meant to be a framework of choice for commercial purposes. Large-scale Scrum was not invented in a reactive way. It was a very organic thing. It was created. It has evolved and has been defined and redefined over years. So just by virtue of having such a long track record that has not been publicized and commercialized and advocated and sold explicitly, people may not know this is the case. It does exist. Large-scale Scrum has a thoroughly documented history that goes back so many years, and there are 600 plus experiments and experiences. So if nothing else, lessons from the field are there. There are quite a few very thorough, very detailed case studies that have been written about LeSS adoptions. They're all on LeSS.work site, and they're available to you, to everyone. They are not written just by LeSS co-founders. They're written by trainers and LeSS coaches and people that have actually implemented LeSS adoptions. And frankly speaking, the community is not big, so you're not going to see a document or a case study published by a large consultancy on LeSS adoption. It just does not exist. But there are individuals out there whose expertise you could leverage, and all of that is based on very long track record of lessons learned. And of course, the 3 books did not come out of nowhere. I mean, you can't beat time. I don't think it's easy to reverse time back and write a book in reverse, but it was done in LeSS very organically, chronologically from going back to 2008.
Thank you, Gene. That's time.
Okay, so SAFE is out there and very public. We didn't make really no bones about that. And there's kind of 5 big areas. We have tons and tons of case studies, right? There are dozens of case studies on scaledagileFramework.com in lots of different industries, and many global partners that also help make sure those get done. The case studies are all written by people who have implemented. Most of them are from the customer's point of view and written by those customers, not by the consultancies, although there are some that are that way. You've got a global community of SAFE program consultant trainers, SPCTs, SPCs, global community there, and we're all responsible and really have kind of an accountability to not only do good work and add value and help organizations make these big shifts, but also to feed those learnings back into the system. So there's a number of community platforms and other ways to share what we're learning with each other and to feed it back into the system. So there's lots of communities. We've got the 2 big main conferences every year. One in Europe and one that's usually in North America. This time, I think it's in Denver next year in September. And so we've got that. Then there's a whole global partnership that not only is about implementing and helping organizations implement, but also providing the authors of the framework opportunities to take these Gemba experiments, right, and to go out and to try. And there was probably a year's worth of business agility experiments going on prior to 5.0, which just officially launched, kind of moved from, preview site to full production site this week. So there's a lot of very robust interactions to try to keep those lessons flowing, right? And some would say might even be too much to keep up with, but there's a lot that we're trying to share as we grow.
Thank you, Scott. That's your time.
This is Rob. it's an awesome time to be a Scrum and Scale trainer. The framework's a little less than 2 years old, which provides a lot of opportunity for influence. So we actually do a lot of field work coming in. I mean, the truth be told is the framework is founded on some papers. I actually wrote a paper 10 years ago, which is cited on the Scrum and Scale site. So there's a lot of thinking that's gone into it, but it's a growing framework. And I think most of my colleagues at Scrum and Scale would agree that there's a lot of opportunity to help inform the framework through field work, experience reports, and really help drive that framework to really to really adapt as we move forward here. So part of it, I think, is just due to the fact that the framework's new. It provides us a lot of opportunity to really reach into the field, get those case studies, get those experience reports, and drive from practical experience as opposed to truly theoretical ones or academic ones. So it's a great time. And if you do have interest, you know, the group, and I think the other frameworks do this as well, you know, reach out to these frameworks, let them know that you have some ideas, have some feedback. In my experience, I've never been rejected for offering feedback. I mean, I get incorporated, but I've never been rejected. So, you know, these are our frameworks, I'm going to argue. You know, we use them. We're the practitioners. We send the hundreds of dollars of checks to these organizations every year to keep certified. You know, I think it's something that we should take ownership of as well. And so that's the way I would argue it.
Thank you. When would you advise the organization to use a different framework? When is your framework is not recommended?
Okay, so I'm going to say this. I guess I'm going to use a bit of a reverse psychology here, but I'm sure you're going to catch me doing it anyway. So if someone wants to play an Agile theater, someone wants to pretend that you're being Agile for the sake of being in trend and style, someone wants to put a check mark in the Excel spreadsheet and say, hey, we have flipped that many teams from something to Scrum, we put them on Jira, and now they're Agile. If a company wants just to rearrange deck seats on Titanic, relabel existing roles into some new jargon, if a company is not willing to approach its existing organizational dysfunctions at a root cause head on, if a company is not willing to change and challenge roles that could be dysfunctional or outdated, if senior leadership is opting out from deep education, we would typically say, why don't you do something else, or just don't change anything. Do not create an Agile theater. Large scale Scrum isn't for you. Let alone, I don't think even Scrum is for you. You probably want to do something else. There was no eagerness, there was no need, at least not in less community, to conquer the world by adapting fake less left, right, and center. We'd rather be deep and narrow, very methodical and specific in those places where companies and individuals really want to see changes. We want to see urgency for change, as John Carter puts it, right? We want to see companies willing to remain relevant in years to come. And instead of just avoiding, instead of doing some crazy dramatic downsizing every 3, 4, 5 years and letting go a bunch of people, we want companies to gradually, methodically become more lean and more light-footed. And those are the companies we want. Everyone else, and we don't. We don't recommend even attempting it unless organization was serious about improving system dynamics and internal root cause of dysfunctions.
Thank you, Gene. Scott?
Scott, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, the dog barked earlier, so I was trying to head that off. You know, if organizations aren't interested in sustaining themselves over time, then yeah, I agree. Don't change. Just leave it the way it is and wind yourself down. Right? In most organizations today, the risk of being outpaced, not only by the competitors you know, but all the ones you don't know, is really inexpensive to do and can come at you in a completely unknown and unknowable way. So if you want to have that sort of continuous learning, adaptable culture, you're going to have to do something, right? And whatever that, is, and however deep and rich you need that transformation to be, a lot depends on where you are today. But if you don't need to scale, if sticking with basic organizational, or let's just call it team and technical agility, if that's enough, then stick with Scrum and stick with the combination of things like Scrum and Kanban and do great work and add value. That's fine. There's no need to check the scaling box just because it's the thing everyone's talking about. But I do think it's important to be thinking about these broader competencies of organizational development that I think a lot of us are beginning to spend a lot more time in. I know I do. I spend a lot more time outside of IT and discussions than I do in anymore. And that's good. I like the product development space that's separate from, the delivery that we've grown up with. And I like thinking about things, from other parts of the organization's point of views. And I think that's really where people are going to want to focus and not get sort of wrapped up by, well, which framework not. It's more about, well, what problem are you trying to solve?
Thank you, Scott. That's time. Rob?
Yeah, I'm with I'm with Scott on this one. If you're in a position where you're doing well and you're not growing or scaling, don't use a scaling framework. It kind of makes sense, right? I remember I had a team that I was working with, and we were rotating the Scrum Master, and they got really good at it. Everybody that took on the role, we made it suck for everybody, right? So, everybody had the chance to be the Scrum Master. And after a while, the role of the Scrum Master was almost not needed because the practice had been incorporated into the culture of the team. So anybody would remove an impediment. Anybody would start to stand up. We just didn't need to have a Scrum Master. But the Scrum Master came up to me and asked me, he said, Rob, if we don't really need the Scrum Master, should we have one? And my advice to them was, absolutely. I said, are you doing Scrum? And they said, yes. And I said, well, if you're doing Scrum, then you need a Scrum Master. And the lesson was basically, listen, when it hits the fan, you're going to be glad you had that Scrum Master, right? Even though they're not being practiced every day. So, to Scott's point, if you think you're going to scale and you start scaling and then you decide to go look for a way to do the scaling, it's already too late. So, have these things in the back of the mind. It doesn't matter which, in my honest opinion, it doesn't matter which scaling framework you choose at this level, right? Pick any one. Don't hesitate, okay? Don't look for the perfect solution. But if you're getting prepared to scale, then start looking at these things and try to see which way you might want to roll when it starts to happen to you. Because deciding this after the fact it's just too late.
Thank you. How would you start implementing your framework? What were the first steps?
So I need to position myself right. Am I being a company that wants to implement less or adapt less, or am I a less a trainer and consultant who comes in to help? I would rather take the former stance as opposed to the latter, because with the latter, it's pretty straightforward. It's just me as Gene, what I would do. But if I was a company, if I represented a company, well, what I would do first I would get real help, real professional help from experienced people that are not just certification collectors and have a fancy resume with their long trail of acronyms, but someone who has actually done it, especially for large-scale Scrum adoption that requires a lot of interaction and influence of senior management. You want to have someone who is pretty well versed in doing that. Someone who has a wide gamut of capabilities, an array of capabilities and experience in various organizational design domains, not just IT, not just business or operations, not just DevOps, as often people mislabel an engineering practice, right? But also in finance and marketing and HR and vendor management. Also, I would be very keen as an organization to do a very thorough self-assessment to make sure my senior leadership, as an organization, has given an informed consent and is willing and ready to learn alongside with individuals, with teams that actually are going to be performing work. I should be able to revisit my organizational charts, top to bottom, remove, not necessarily add roles, processes, tools, procedures, and also support team formation, autonomy, and sovereignty and purpose. And of course, on mechanical side, on technical side, it would be initial backlog creation, initial product backlog refinement, product ownership, identification, subject matter experts. In less huge, which is hundreds of people, it is a little more complex. In fact, one of the questions I'm going to address when my time comes, do less adoptions require longest prep? I believe so. I believe for proper less adoption, lots of prep work needs to be done. In my case, it was, I think, about 2 to 3 months of very thorough work before we could flip the switch.
Thank you, Dean. It's time. Scott?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll echo some of that, and in terms of the conversations that have to take place. And we used to say in the earlier evolutions and implementations, it was kind of a middle out transformation. We would say, train everyone that's going to be involved right away, the teams of Agile teams, and then launch a train and get the learning, and then start to iterate and experiment. As that has grown and evolved and matured, and organizations are moving beyond that understanding, there's more of an initial inflection point, a decision point where you have to say, okay, I want to try and experiment with this. And so you need that leadership conversation to understand the problem to be solved, right? It's because it's never about adopting a framework. It's always about delivering business value better than we do today, better product development, better execution, whatever the issues are that we're trying to solve. I think there's a combination. I agree with Gene that you need experts, people who have really done it, because not only do they recognize very quickly both the patterns that a culture has and what they're going to need to make a shift, right, and what those gaps are, but they can very quickly see the anti-patterns. And so that's a very, very important when you're starting to scale up, because when it gets that complex, and it does very quickly, you need that expertise. But along with that, you have to find those change agents in an organization, in whatever part that you're changing, or broader across and I can't remember if it was Gene or Rob who said very early on, right, that you need to not simply have people who are saying, yes, we want to do this, but actually are committed to being a part of it and lead by example. You need that very early on. And that, there's a safe implementation roadmap, which is a good, I would say, I call it the starter story in terms of how implementations are typically go, but it isn't meant to be necessarily the end all for everyone. And so you take a look at where you are in that journey for yourselves, and you evolve from there.
Thank you, Scott. Rob?
This is an area where Scrum at Scale is actually fairly prescriptive, which is nice. The first step in a transformation for Scrum at Scale is to establish an EAT, or an executive action team. The reason for that is the executive action team, and the intention of the word is intentional there. This is executives, okay? So this is people with C's in front of their names. They're the ones that truly own the transformation themselves. It's not an activity that a CIO will just check into. It's that they're on the team that owns that backlog. And then the second thing is to develop that transformation backlog. Now, every organization is going to have a different backlog. There are, for any of you that have explored Scrum at Scale, you may be familiar with the various pillars that they identify, everything from release planning to backlog prioritization, as to what's important to you and what are you doing well, and deciding there as a rough prioritization. So the things that are really important to you that you're not doing well are probably the first things you should push on to try to bring about that transformation. I would argue personally that as an addendum to that organizational impediment removal should be top of the list as well. So be ready to put into place, and to Scott's point, you do need some experts to begin with. Standing up an effective impediment removal process is a good one, is a good thing to start with. Of course, the EAT should be there and ready to remove those impediments. And that's how you kind of get started on these things. It's not an all-at-once implementation. I've done all-at-once implementations in large companies, and they're really hard. Kaikaku is tough, tough, tough. I much prefer Kaizen. The approach that Scrum at Scale supports is really building a reference model. So let's not take 3,000 person organization. Let's take a program. Let's take 100 people. Let's take 50 people. Get them operating at scale, okay? Because the first thing you're going to do is start to hit organizational impediments at a small scale. Why make everybody suffer with it? Why make it suck for everybody? You can find out with a small set of teams where your organizational impediments are. So for example, we need to invest in test automation. You don't need to make 3,000 engineers suffer to figure that out. So that's really how Scrum at Scale sees it. Establish that EAT, build that transformation backlog. And then my caveat on that is be ready to remove impediments and start with a reference model.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. And finally, this is the last prepared question that I have is, how do you see a future of your framework?
This is me, Gene. So how do I see, what do I see less in years to come? So first, what I don't see less conquering the world and becoming the next best thing since sliced bread that everyone their mother has adopted. It's not going to be the next trendy thing that each company is going to unpack and install for thousands of dollars. Less will remain as will continue evolving in the evolutionary way as opposed to revolutionary way. Its historical track record will continue growing, but very gradually. I think it is linear today. The slope has become a little more steep. I don't anticipate this to become an exponential growth. I still believe that the share of market share, global market share for true interest, for less adoption, just like improving organizational agility overall, is rather very slim. So I do not expect less to become this next bombastic, trendy thing. But I will say this: those organizations that are really serious about improving themselves and remaining lean and nimble and resilient to some market shift trends and challenges are going to be very benefited if they experimented at least with some part of their organization by ring fencing and circumventing it from the other part, from the rest of the organization. So this is something that I do expect, and I also expect 2020 and on the world will become, I think, a little more cognizant, and will be easier for companies and individuals to recognize agile theater or agile seat shifting on Titanic, as we call it, and it will be a little, patience will become a little thinner to those fake adoptions that we see left, right, and center. Some of them are by installing what is out there available, and some of them are internally manufactured by people that do not understand organizational agility because they never invested in self-education. In fact, that's a good litmus test. Who are your coaches? Who are your guide level people? Have they done enough legwork to get where they are today, to do what they claim they can? So that's my vision. Yep, time out.
Time.
All right. Okay. So where's my prop? Oh, here's my prop. So, future looks bright. SAFe just came out with 5.0, which, yep, it's another iteration. But the purpose is really to try to evolve a lot of the thinking going out there and getting into lean business operations, agility beyond IT, looking at what are those competencies that organizations need to have. It's the biggest thing we get requests for from companies in this space. And not everything we do, in the world that I work in is always safe. But people are asking for the same things. Okay, we understand what we need to do. We're not doing team and technical agility well, but we're working on it. But what we really need is this other stuff. Can you tell me about continuous learning cultures? Can you tell me about enterprise delivery and lean portfolio and new ways of budgeting? So I think those sort of competencies at an organizational level, that's the future, at least that I think we're going to focus on in the near term, and then let that evolve and let the market and the people doing the work tell us what's next. And in SAFE, when we had a conference, this was 2 years ago, we had a big conference, and everyone from the SBCs and beyond, they all contributed to what should SAFE work on next? What should the Scaled Agile folks work on next? And what they brought to the table for what they thought, and then what everyone else who was at the conference contributed was different. And everyone asked for business agility, and that was not as much on the radar for the Scaled Agile folks. But they heard that, and then they responded to that. So I think that's going to continue, at least in the near term.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity here. I want to echo Gene's comment around the idea that I personally think that the world is tired of crappy leadership. I'm kind of old school when it comes to management. My master's is in engineering management. And I think that the role of leadership is to establish culture and to help make decisions. And the idea that I think when I work with senior executives, I think that the world's getting tired of everyone gets a gold star kinds of approaches here. And the idea that we can say we're doing Agile and it doesn't have anything to do with being Agile, I think these days are going behind us because results matter today. Things are moving too fast. We're starting to lean out our systems, and the number is going to count. So, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for, frankly, all of the frameworks that are effective and recognize and support leadership in owning these practices. And this is where I think this is one of the reasons why I do like Scrum at Scale, is because it really puts a lot of accountability. As an Agile consultant, it helps me put accountability on leadership, and I can simply explain to them, listen, go read Shine, and let's talk about the establishment of culture and change within your organization. If you don't believe me, as a consultant, you are more than welcome to fire me, and I'll move on to your competition, okay? But at the end of the day, I think Scrum at Scale today it's still young, so it is open to the community, the full community, to contribute. Like I said, if you have feedback, I'm happy to check in and change into GitHub. And of course, Jeff's the chief product owner, so he'll have to get it past him. But at the end of the day, I think that these frameworks are going to hold teams more accountable, leadership more accountable, and will grow in that direction. And I think Scrum at Scale is very well set up for moving in that direction.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you for all your answers. I also want to thank members of CTC user group. I see some of these names on the call for helping us setting up these questions. And with this, I would pass the ball to my colleagues, Emilia and Saf, to facilitate a Q&A session, and we want to do it in a slightly different format.
Yeah, so for the next section, we'll go ahead and read one of the questions that was posted to the chat during the panel discussion portion, and give all three panelists the opportunity to answer the question. We'll have an initial 5-minute time box, and then we'll sort of take a poll on whether we should extend or move on to the next question. Safe, do you want to go ahead with the first question?
Thank you, Emilia. Thanks, guys. I'll go ahead. The first question is to be very specific, a little bit targeted towards Gene, but I would say we can follow the same. Every panelist can answer. I'll start with Gene, and I'll read it word to word. So hopefully, if you need explanation, please ask me back. the basic challenge always we face how we integrate the design sprints or architecture requirements as part of product backlog. Is there any way Les gives any advantage on this?
First of all, I'm not familiar with the term design sprint in Scrum. So since less is Scrum, I don't think it would apply to it. But as far as I'm concerned, design, just like architecture and development and testing, is a part of what a team should do. So in one sprint, it could be more or less design. In the other sprint, could be more or less of development. But I don't necessarily support the notion of design sprint or hardening sprint or test sprint or development sprint or business analysis sprint, because to me it's just a mini waterfall, sequential, phase-gated development that is dressed up as something called Scrum. I do believe, however, when you initiate, when you kick off, when your first sprint, oh, by the way, there's no such thing as sprint zero. It's usually invented by people that are afraid to call it one because they're afraid they're not going to deliver anything in the first sprint. But in any case, in those sprints, in the very first sprint, there could be a possibility that you don't have much to show, but if you have good standing relationship with the product owner, he or she will appreciate that whatever you put in place, foundation, infrastructure, is towards your potentially shippable product that may come in the second sprint. So it's not uncommon. But as far as design sprint alone, or treating a designer as a special cow, I don't necessarily subscribe to this at all.
Thanks, Gene. Scott, would you like to take the same question and answer it in terms of SAFe?
Yeah, I'll talk about it in terms of what we call continuous exploration, and it's really part of. I agree. There's generally no separate design sprint per se, but there is a set of continuous exploration, continuous development and integration, and continuous deployment and releasing. And within that cycle, right, whether it's you're following lean startup cycle or something similar, there's a lot of things that you have to do, right? You hypothesize about what it is you're trying to solve, right? What does the customer need? And maybe that's where you're developing your initial journey maps and other things to try to get at the heart of those points of view from the customer. You're doing the market research, but it's continuous, right? And as you learn, you evolve, you create those early MVP ideas and on your Gemba walks and figure out what you need to do. And as that synthesis comes together, you start to develop, the stuff, right? Whatever those things are that you're trying to build. So I think you think of it like that in sort of a continuous loop. That's part of the overall cycle, not independent. Doesn't happen off to the side in a vacuum. But it is one of those things that product developers, especially in a non-traditional, non-IT development world, they like to think about.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Robert, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. Just at the top, I think that really what it comes down to is this is a dependency management situation. I agree with my panelists here that, ideally an organization is not doing a design sprint and then a development sprint and a test sprint, But the truth is that I work with organizations that have challenges, and sometimes they're doing them. Sometimes they're doing hardening sprints. And, for me to walk in and just tell them you shouldn't do this, it's stupid, it's not really good for business. But the truth of the matter is that really what we're looking at is we have dependencies. So if we can look, and the Scrum Scale talks about dependency management, if we can look at the dependencies, why do we have a dependency between a design phase and an engineering phase? Like, why aren't they tighter? What are some of the impediments that are in the way that are preventing this from happening? In my experience, it could very well be that the product and engineering organizations report to one VP and customer experience is reporting to another. And in order to get alignment on goal, we have some organizational impediments. We're not scaling effectively. So really, I don't want to answer the question with it depends, but in a sense, it does depend. My proposal would be to ask the question, why are we doing it that way? Because it's less efficient. And see if it's the most important impediment we should be addressing at this point in time. Awesome. We know it's less expensive, but it's expensive to do it this way. But is it the most important thing?
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Emilia, would you like to ask the next question?
Yeah, so the next question that we have from folks was, would you all agree or disagree that the senior management mindset is the biggest constraint for big organizations to change? How does your framework address that?
My turn. So I think it's a very again, it's another trendy statement that senior management inability to I think it's a bit of an echo. Senior management inability to get up to speed is the main reason. I think it is one of the big reasons. I don't deny this for a minute, but I think it's not the only big reason. I think there are some other big ones. I think the industry itself has mutated in a way, and there is so much confusion out there today that even senior leadership, even senior management, that even those genuine folks that want to change are getting confused. There's so much out there. And my personally, my 2020 resolution is to start removing as opposed to adding. There's way too much stuff out there. There is so much confusion, and it includes not just ways and methods of working and various frameworks or quasi frameworks. There's so many things out there, but also individuals that are confused in organizations. So I think the challenge is multifaceted today. Granted, senior leadership is one of the well, I shouldn't say leadership, senior management, because the difference between a leader and a manager. Senior management does present one of the big challenges because they're not willing to embrace learning, but it's not the only reason why. Today, things have slightly changed, and there are other reasons that are no less critical. And I'm going to leave it at that. So, it is one of the main reasons.
Scott, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would. Good stuff. And I'll the quote I took from Rob earlier, which I totally loved, and I'm going to totally quote you multiple times on this now.
Take credit for it, man.
The world is getting tired of crappy leadership. and I think that's a very, very good way of stating it. You know, leaders are gonna have to make a shift, but it's not all on them, right? And there's so many different complexities to this this issue and this problem to be solved. But they own a lot of it because they're in those leadership roles, right? They're there to set the mindset and the principles and lead by example, and they've got to know enough to lead the change. They can't say, well, I've got people doing Agile, right? I used to hear that from CIOs all the time, right? You know, well, they're doing Agile, right? They suck at it, but they're doing it. You know, and that's usually, you know, a pretty good indicator that you've got a leadership problem as well. But I do agree. I think the pace of change is there, and we can't have leaders sort of being the laggards anymore. And really, honestly, it's anyone in the organization, right? The pace of change, we have to solve these things across the enterprise, you know, in a system thinking way. You know, that extra weight has got to go away.
Thank you, Scott. Robert, would you like to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, I really believe that the way business agility has been done in the past 20 years and the way it will be done in the next 5 years are totally different. I really believe we're at an inflection point. And one of the pieces of evidence of this was a quote that I picked up in August of this year. And the quote is, major employers are investing in their workers and communities because they know it is the only way to be successful over the long term. This is coming out of the Business Roundtable, and it was no other than JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon that said this. This is 20 years ago, these guys had said that shareholder value is the only thing that matters. The world has shifted, and senior leaders are starting to see it. And fortunately, I think, Scott, almost to your point here, this is a self-correcting system. Organizations will either figure this out or they won't. And I'm a capitalist, and I have no problems with large companies being acquired for 10 cents on the dollar because they can't figure this stuff out. So I really think we're moving in the wrong direction. So I don't think senior management or senior leadership is the problem. I think senior leaders and senior managers can be. Okay, so it comes down to individuals blocking you. But overall, as an organization, I believe in the hierarchical systems that we have in these institutions. We have to have some level of bureaucracy. This is not, corporations are not democracies, and those are who our clients are right now. So we need to recognize that.
Thanks, Robert. I'll ask the next question, and this is favorite to me. It does comes to me in various ways also, and it gets asked in different ways. I'm going to read the exact verbiage, but think of it, it's related to innovation and things of those nature. Experimentation ways of thinking and ways of working are different and are not fully manifested in the agile frameworks of today, not yet. Most of our agile frameworks are very software engineering oriented. Gene.
So am I to challenge this, or am I to address it from a standpoint of large-scale Scrum?
I would say you have to address it from like, how does this gets addressed when we are scaling, that we have innovation taken care of, we have R&D taken care of.
So again, I guess, I mean, I need to maybe make it a more stressful statement. A large-scale Scrum is, to a large extent, to a huge extent, is an organization, is a framework that addresses agile engineering practices. But first and foremost, it's an organizational design framework that entails R&D, research and development, site strategies, finance and budgeting, business and operations, and almost any organizational domain that is involved in supporting internal dynamics. So it would be unfair to say that just because large-scale Scrum is Scrum and Scrum was originally invented for software development, less does not entail the entire gamut of what you may face in the organization. I truly, genuinely invite everyone to think of less, not just as a framework, but as a body of knowledge that has been accumulated over many years. Don't read all 3 books, pick one. Let's see if you read the other 2. Look at the guides and principles and experiments that go for pages. Look at the case studies, and you will realize that organizational domains, organizational dimensions that we touch during less adoptions by far are not just technology. By far, it is. Those are such deep and narrow and systemic efforts. These are not superficial, powdering type of efforts that just come and go. These are much more sustainable, much deeper efforts that we make.
Thanks, Gene. Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that and echo a lot of those same sentiments in that, SAFe, in fact, we have spent a lot of time with business teams or non-development teams because everyone's delivering products or services of some sort, right? And no matter where you are in the organization, you have customers, you have requests, you have things that need to get done. And irrespective of what is in your backlog, it's still a backlog and it's still work to get accomplished. And everything you do has a series of impediments and has a series of sort of value stream steps that need to get done. So I do think you're going to keep seeing this extension beyond, the original Agile Manifesto. For many years, I've had, and I've seen a lot of people kind of saying, well, and here, instead of saying software, you say products and services, right? And so they'll describe it differently. And I think that's going to continue and going to be very important. In fact, we run into this a lot, maybe less so in the past couple of years, but we used to run into this a lot where people would say, Agile is an IT thing. We don't do that over here. We're in manufacturing. We'll do lean, right? Even though they both come from the same organic roots, but we'll do lean, but we won't do Agile, right? And I think it's all sort of blending, and that's why we say lean Agile a lot across the whole industry, because we're trying to show that it's all just work.
Thank you. Robert?
Yeah, I'd agree. All of this stuff comes down to validated learning cycles. And it kind of cracks me up because when I talk about validated learning cycles in lean startup, the circle goes to the right, goes clockwise. And in design thinking, it happens to go counterclockwise. Those are the differences in the frameworks, right? So, when design and innovation come into play, part of the reason, so to answer the question specifically, Scrum at Scale has a product owner cycle. And this is where this comes into play. There is an integration piece where we're releasing our product, we're gathering feedback from the field and others, and any other source that we have. This is Reinertson's fuzzy front end, right? Grab that feedback and integrate that into your product owner loop. But that said, how do you do that? I think one of the things that I hit often is, the idea of the innovation budget. It's almost as if, you're supposed to go innovate for free. I need you to work 60 hours a week and then innovate too. And innovation takes time, it takes reflection, it takes teams that understand their capacity and value thinking. So where do you get that from? I'm going to propose that this is where the lean aspect comes into play. If you can lean out your system, and by removing impediments and so forth, you're going to free those teams up to have capacity to do things like think. And when they think, they do pretty cool stuff. And if you have good prioritization mechanisms in place and a good way to bring that strategy to backlog, then that innovation starts to creep into your standard operating procedures in many ways. So that's the way I would see it.
Thanks, Robert. Emilia, would you like to ask the next question, please?
Yes, Scrum Butt. Since Scrum is such a simple framework, it's pretty easy using this concept to discover potential dysfunctions. Is there a similar concept with your scaling frameworks? Less but, safe but, or Scrum at Scale but?
Me up. Good question. So I would actually recommend folks to look into the less onion or the less 4 concentric circles that has principles and frameworks and rules and experiments. So there are certain rules in less that we strongly advise not to break. They're minimalistic, but they're pretty important for less adoptions to succeed. There are principles that support those rules and guides that help you meet your goals. And there are 600 plus experiments that you may try and avoid. So those are conditional, situational. They may work in one place, but not in the other, or depending on your organizational, mechanics and organizational nuances. So there are certain things, minimalistic things that we want you to do in order for less to be given a chance. Now, when we say Scrum but or anything else but, it effectively implies someone did not want to try what was originally recommended, but they immediately went to plan B. So I would first ask, why did you go to plan B without trying plan A? Is it because you hardly tried it, did not work, or because you felt it isn't something you want to challenge? So yeah, I mean, the but implies that that we're not following some prescribed or some mandatory set of rules. And there was a minimalistic set of rules in less. We strongly recommend not to break them. In fact, if there is a strong trend that someone is going to do the but thing, as I mentioned before, just don't bother, because you will create bad reputation for something that is meant some very genuinely, and also you will create misguidance for your colleagues, for others that surround you, and you will be misinformed. So just don't do that.
Thanks, Gene. Scott.
Yeah, I would agree. Don't do that. I think it's it's the classic. I have impediments. I don't know how to get around them, so I'm just going to ignore that part of the guidance, right? In SAFE, just to be a little bit more specific, there are guardrails and guidance that we provide, and things like essential SAFE, right? There's these sort of 10 key elements. If you're not doing PI events and getting everyone together with PI planning, you're not using SAFE, right? You're not doing SAFE. You can use Scrum, you can use Kanban, you can use both, you can use a mix, and do all the other things that are sort of key elements of safe, you know, and that's fine. But if you don't have an architectural runway, you're not doing safe. If you're not following good, lean, agile principles, then you're not agile, and therefore you're not doing safe. So I think there's those success factors and sort of guardrails that everything needs to have in place. And just using an excuse to say, well, here we can't do that, right? We've got an impediment that we just can't get over. You know, that's usually an organization that's, you know, struggles with truth and transparency and trust. You know, they tend to have bigger problems.
Thanks, Scott. Robert, would you like to add anything?
Sure, yeah, I agree with my colleagues here. You know, fundamentally, you know, to answer the question directly, if you're, you know, we're doing Scrum at scale, but we don't engage leadership or have any contact with them. If we're doing Scrum at scale, but we don't really worry about impediment removal, then you're not really doing it. But I think the common theme that you're hearing here, and at least from what I've seen in my experience often, is that when you get into these situations, it's people that are trying to do the framework as opposed to understanding how to apply the framework. The framework, there's no, I'm just gonna say it right here, there is no value in Agile, people. There's none, okay? It's, there's only Agile when it's applied to teams and products and everything else. It's a tool in the same way that a hammer has no value until it strikes the nail. So if you don't understand the principles behind why you would use a hammer, and when you need a screwdriver, you should probably apply it then. So when in these frameworks, if you don't, you need to have some level of expertise and understanding of why you would apply these practices in these frameworks. Just doing them is going to result in Scrum bug. We're doing stand-ups, so we must be doing Scrum. It's the opposite of that anti-pattern, right? It is not, that is maybe a necessary sufficient of Scrum, but it's not a sufficient condition for Scrum. So really, in my mind, what you're looking for is you want to have enough education and understanding of these frameworks. You don't have to be religious. You don't have to know how to pitch Kneffin. Don't worry about that stuff. Just, you know, understand why you're applying PI planning. Why is PI planning important? Okay. Why is dependency management important in Nexus? You know, why is organizational design important in less? And then ask yourselves the questions of, you know, what am I willing to do? And then move forward, as opposed to saying, yep, checkbox, checkbox, checkbox.
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to ask the next question again. This is dear to me. It's written differently. And you all have said definitely that if you do not believe and management and leadership don't care, what would you advise? There are so many coaches and experts sitting here. What would you advise an organization to do to decide which framework should they go for? Or what would you ask them to do as a homework before they call one of you experts? Gene.
I'm struggling to, and I don't know who the question, where the question came from. I don't think I subscribe to the notion, to the question, what framework to use. I mean, I would like to approach it from a different angle. I mean, what problem are we trying to solve? I mean, what exactly isn't working today that you're trying to solve with Scrum or Kanban or XP or Scrumban or any scaled solution for that matter? I can tell you more often than not, I know that people look into Agile thing and look what's under that umbrella without truly understanding what they're trying to do. In all essence, I'd rather see ran, as good as it could get, old-fashioned waterfall sequential delivery, at least done by a well-known script, as opposed to some quasi and Agile in name only, you know, something that it doesn't really deliver anything that was promised. So I'm really not sure if that's something that resonates with me strongly. I mean, I've seen so many places where what people call scaling is really not scaling, but copy pasting. Just because you have 100 teams running around doing so-called Scrum doesn't mean you're scaling. In fact, if you have even 20 teams running around that have nothing to do with one another, each one working on a separate product or service, working for a different product owner, this isn't scaling. This is copy pasting Scrum. Worse yet, if some of these teams are not even feature-centric, but component-centric, you can very easily camouflage and pretend you're scrumming, but you work only in a single component, and you deliver IOU at the end of the sprint. So in that case, what framework would help you? You're still executing in an old-fashioned way. You're doing the same old thing, but you're just repurposing terminology, reusing it. So I'm not sure if I could give a very constructive advice here. My best advice would be to really try to understand, what are you trying to fix? What isn't working? Maybe you don't want to change anything, because changing something and doing something half-baked, half-assed, forgive my French, doesn't really add value.
Thank you, Gene.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Scott. How would you answer that?
You're on mute, Scott.
There we go. All change has a cost. I agree. So don't change if you don't need to, because it's going to take cycles away from the organization. You know, I don't know. I'm with you. I think I always write sort of 5 questions on the board when I start this conversation with folks. And the first one is always, what problem are you trying to solve? Right. And the second one is, well, what practices and process changes do you think you need? Right. And maybe you have the answers, maybe you don't, maybe you've tried some experiments and you talk through those. And then what kind of people and skills and what skills do they have, and how are we going to leverage those, or what skills do they need? And that people capability question. And you know, and what do you need those behaviors to look like? You know, what does that look like in your new world? So you kind of have this you know, conversation around the problem, and then what it is that you want to look like, the postcard from the future, and then figure out what are the opportunities that you have in running experiments, you know, with either the different frameworks, or at the very least, just educate yourself, right? Yes, you can bring in experts, and everyone can do a really great presentation. Lots of PowerPoints out there. But that doesn't mean it's going to work for you, right? Your organization. So you really have to educate yourself and understand why they exist. What were they trying to solve? Do you have those same problems? What kind of experiments? Do you have access to the expertise? You know, and you may have the best expertise, maybe something you didn't consider as the answer, but that's what's right there, and they've got deep, rich expertise. Then try that, right? That may be the best way to experiment.
Thanks, Scott. Robert?
One of the tricks that we deal with, and so this would be more to the coaches and the consultants out there. We all know this. The frameworks that we're describing here are intrinsically simple. These are not complicated things. Okay. It doesn't take much. I mean, you know, the Agile Manifesto is 2 pages long. The Scrum Guide is 19, right? So I think what ends up happening is a lot of folks have a tendency to confuse knowledge for skill for expertise, right? So if I can Google it and read it, and I can understand it intrinsically, that means that I have expertise. It is just not true, because what really matters here is what's happening under the covers. And I'd actually pull back to our kind of customer experience, user experience kinds of ideas here. You know, be empathetic for your clients. If you're in leadership, be empathetic for your organization. I mean, truly have empathy for what's actually happening, to understand that problem and stay in that problem space. Much like my colleague was saying here, understanding that problem space is the most important thing. That's one piece of advice, that you can understand what tools you do want to bring to bear. I would argue that if you're developing any product or service in the 21st century, you're going to need an agile lean system. Okay, waterfall is antiquated at this point. You need to transition on. So get over it. Let's not have the religious debate about that. Just move on. But when it comes to which framework you want to use, it's really to depend upon the culture and the needs of your organization, how rapidly you need to change, how structured you are, how hierarchical you are, and try to understand that problem. After you've gotten past the problem, I propose don't take yourself too seriously. I had a client once that in 1 year went from version 1 to Rally to Jira back to version 1, okay? And you know, they were looking for the perfect tool. And it's like, guys, there isn't one. You're gonna have to customize this tool version 1 doesn't know how financial services does their business practices, okay? So you're gonna have to customize this framework to meet the needs of your organization if we're gonna do this in a grown-up world. So my second piece of advice is don't look for the perfect solution. Understand the frameworks well enough to bring them to bear. Each situation will have some sweet spots for SAFe, for LESS, for Nexus, for Scrum at Scale, for all these frameworks. They might be a best fit. But please understand that it's not going to be just a cookie cutter, hand off a PowerPoint deck to Scott's point and walk away. Those days are behind us.
Thank you, guys. And I think we have 5 minutes left for the session. Shasha, would you like to take it back?
Thank you, guys. Thank you, panelists, for all your answers. I also want to thank my colleagues for organizing it and for facilitating it tonight. I am recording this session, as I mentioned, and I hope, if nothing is broken, I would be able to post the recording tomorrow. I will publish the link to LinkedIn. I would publish it on bln.org. I believe I sent the link at the beginning. It was a record. We had 89 people on the call today, an absolute record for this group. I hope you found this useful, and please be aware we are getting together every second Wednesday of the month. So I would like to invite you to follow us and join us for the following sessions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you
you very
all.
much.
Thank you for joining us. Thank
Bye
you,
now.
especially to
Thank
Scott,
you,
Gene, and Bob.
Gene. Thank you,
Thank
Scott.
you.
Thank you,
Thank you all.
Robert. Thanks a lot, all the participants. Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Avoid DDTs, tech-driven transformations.